to a new live session from the U.S. Embassy social media platforms in Bogota. For those who are watching us today, I would like to invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can keep up to date with all our activities. You can send your comments and questions throughout the broadcast, and we will be sharing them with our guests and at the end of the program and answering some of those questions, hopefully. And we also encourage you to share your comments using the hashtag ADA31. Today, we're here to celebrate the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, better known as ADA. The ADA, which was signed in 1990, is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. The purpose of this law is to ensure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. Taking accessibility as an example, one of the important parts of the ADA is that it required that buses be constructed accessibly with a specific date by which that had to happen. And provisions like buses that were currently on the road could stay on the road until their expiration time, but the new buses that would replace these ones would have to be accessible. Likewise with schools, schools is like another example. It was necessary to ensure that everyone would be able to benefit from education. And of course that required to make some accommodations on the built environment immediately at that point. Any renovation made would have to be accessible, and any new school that was built would have to meet all the standards of the whole building to be accessible. So anytime something is being renovated and being built new in the US, it has to be accessible. That's one of the things of the ADA. So it's a combination of making sure that people are not denied and are not discriminated at any moment. My name is Liliana Castellanos. I work at the Public Affairs Office in the US Embassy in Bogota. Today I'm connected from my home office, with a bookshelf, a white bookshelf as a background. And I'm going to introduce our very, very great special guest for our program today. And I would like to ask them to do their very own audio description before we start our conversation. First of all, we have with us Adriana Pulido. She's a Fulbright Scholar from 2011. She's currently working as the inclusion advisor, social inclusion advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross here in Colombia. She received the Fulbright Excellence Award this year, and she will tell us more about her story. Welcome, Adriana. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Liliana. Thanks to the team. I'm really glad to be here in this important panel. As Liliana said, I was a Fulbright Scholar 10 years ago. And this year I received this important award. And it's just this commitment to continue working for inclusion for people with disabilities in Colombia.
Thank you very much, Adriana. Congratulations for your award. It's a very prestigious one, and we are very, very happy to know that you got it this year. Maybe, I don't know if you want to explain for our audience very briefly, what was the scholarship, the Fulbright Scholarship that you got?
Okay.
And how did that happen?
Okay. The Fulbright Scholarship, for those who do not know it, is one of the most prestigious scholarships around the world. And the idea is that it allows people from different countries to do graduate studies in the United States. So I got it thanks to this partnership between Fulbright and the Saldarriaga Concha Foundation. The Saldarriaga Concha Foundation works for people with disabilities and older adults in Colombia. So they established this partnership, and I was the first person with a disability to get the scholarship in Colombia 10 years ago. And I did my master's in mass communication at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you very much, Adriana. I forgot to mention at the beginning, for those of you who are watching us on Facebook and Twitter, you're listening to the Spanish interpretation of the original audio of this program. We're speaking in English today. For those who want to watch or listen to the program in English, you can go to our YouTube channel where you can actually listen to the original audio. Well, now I'm very honored to introduce our second guest today. She's Mrs. Judith Heumann, a lifelong advocate for the rights of disabled people who has been internationally known as the mother of disability rights and is now an internationally recognized leader in the disability rights community. Judy has played a role in the development and implementation of major legislation in the US for disability rights, including the IDEA, the Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I will let Judy, of course, tell us more about her story. Welcome, Judy, to our program today, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Liliana, and it's great to be on this panel with Adriana. First, let me give my description for those people who are blind or low vision. I am a white disabled wheelchair user. I use a motorized wheelchair. I am 73 years old and I had polio in 1949. I live in Washington, D.C., and we are right now in the foyer of my husband and my apartment and surrounded by photos and postcards and drawings and plants and a view of my dining room, which is behind me. I've been an activist since I was young, and I suppose in some way, like when did that happen? I guess maybe a little inkling of it when I was like 5, but more in earnest when I was an early teenager. And it's been important for me throughout my life to work with other disabled people, my age, younger, older, who are really fighting for equality and equity. And so I'm a disability rights activist, and I have done of late in the last year and a half, I have 2 books which have come out, one called Being Human, Heumann, and Rolling Warrior, which is a young adult version of the book. Right now, the book is in English. We're trying to find someone to caption the book. I'm sorry, to translate the book into Spanish. But for those of you who might speak Japanese, the Japanese version of the book is coming out next week.
That's great.
Thank you very much.
Movie,
a movie also called Crip Camp, which we can maybe discuss later.
That's right, for sure. Thank you very much for that introduction, Judy. Before I actually start asking our guests some of the questions we have prepared, I would like to remind our audience that the U.S. Department of State promotes disability rights as basic human rights, not special rights. Therefore, persons with disabilities have the same rights as any other person, to non-discrimination, to access, equality of opportunity, inclusion, and full participation in society. These are not only basic principles underlying the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also a top priority for the current administration, and therefore we're very, very proud to celebrate its anniversary here today with such special guests. So let's get started. I would like to start with Adriana, asking her if you could share with us some of your experience advocating for disability rights in Colombia. When did you get involved in it, and why, Adriana?
Well, there were many factors. I'm aware that I didn't get involved from the very beginning when I started my undergrad course. When I was about to finish the course, I was just thinking about graduating, and that's it. But then something happened, and is that I started looking at the disabilities movement within the blind community, blind and low vision community. So there were some guys who invited me to take part in an association for graduates with disabilities, with visual impairment actually. So that was like my very first introduction. And at the same time, I got connected to a project in the Conservatory of Music at the National University, which is where I studied. And the idea of this project was to promote inclusion of children who were blind or low vision. So I got involved with this project, which was great because I'm also a musician. I forgot to tell you guys, but I studied music when I was a child, from my childhood to my teenage. So it was really to go to the past a little bit, and a nice opportunity to really promote inclusion. And that's what I've been trying to do throughout my career development, to really promote projects that allow people to feel included in society. And currently, in addition to my work as an inclusion advisor, I belong to a network of women who are blind or low vision in Colombia. It gathers women from different departments from Bogota and different departments, and the idea is to work for inclusion and empowerment of these women. So we've been working on raising awareness about different matters, about things that that we are committed to work for. So for instance, one of the topics we work on is violence against women, because women with disabilities need to also understand that it exists and need to also know how to face it. So we work on that. We are also part of events with different networks of women, because the idea is to make ourselves visible for women who do not have disabilities. So that's more or less my my work on inclusion, like from different perspectives, both personally and professionally. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much for sharing that, Adriana. And we'll go back to your work of in the network of women with visual impairment in a moment. I want to go to Judy now. Judy, through your advocacy for disability rights, you have changed the lives of millions of persons with disabilities in the US and in the whole world, actually. So it's kind of the same question for you. When did you get first involved in this, and why?
I started first getting involved, as I was mentioning earlier, I guess when I was really young. And then as I was a teenager and getting older, I was getting more involved, as much for me as for friends and other disabled people. And by that, I mean, every day I was experiencing discrimination. In New York City, at the time that I was growing up, we didn't have like ramps on corners of streets. The buses were not accessible. Many of the stores didn't have ramps or bathrooms that were accessible. And that was only when I was looking at discrimination against, physically disabled people. But then when looking at people who are blind or deaf or had intellectual disabilities or mental health disabilities, the stigma around having a disability is something that we still experience today in the US and in many countries around the world. So I would say it's out of necessity that I have become an advocate, and it's really difficult to leave something which is both personally relevant for how I want to be able to live my life. And also it's, for me, critically important that we want everyone's voices in this fight for equality, whether they use a communication device or they speak like Adriana, you, Liliana, and myself, as well as all other types of disabilities. So it's kind of in my genetics.
Very good, very nice. Thank you, Judy. And I think you've made a point in the past about discrimination, when you see it, of course. All this fight for disabilities rights is something very much like all the fights we've seen historically, but still nowadays, about other civil rights, right? Like women's rights, about racism, about gender equality. And that's why it's interesting to see this is a fight as like any of those that doesn't stop, right? It started many years ago. You started your own one way before the ADA law, and thanks to you in great part, we can talk about the ADA today. And we have the example of Adriana working with women about women's rights from her disability perspective as well. Is that right?
Yes, and I think, there are changes that are going on. For example, Adriana, you can explain the job that you currently have, and you're working with which organization? Adriana, you're muted.
You're muted, yeah.
I'm working with the International Committee of the Red Cross. I'm the inclusion advisor, and we work for people with disabilities who have been violence victims, whether within the armed conflict or urban violence. So we are actually talking about people who have very great needs, they are very vulnerable socially, economically. People whose opportunities for inclusion have been traditionally denied. So we try to work for them so that they could be included in terms of employment, education, and support, because we need to still change the way people look at us as persons with disabilities. And still we have this need of thinking differently about men and women with disabilities, because it's not the same. It's not simply a label we use to name people with disabilities, but we have to think that needs could be very different. So it's something we have to continue working on. But going back a bit to my work, what I like the most about my work is that I don't have the same disability that the people we work for, because we work for people who have physical disabilities. So as you see, it's completely different. People who need mobility aids, but still, the fact that I have a disability gives me this commitment to really work and even fight for their inclusion, and make it possible for them to have better opportunities in life, not only for them, but also for their families. Yes.
I think one of the important parts about your job is in the title. It uses the word inclusion. And the fact that, you're doing, Liliana, the embassy is doing this event. It's not just for disabled people. And I think this is one of the important aspects of the work of the movement. And that is to say that disabled individuals have a right to be fully included in society. But we have to look at the reasons why we haven't been. And creating positions like inclusion specialists in organizations really help the organization do a review of what it's doing right and what more it needs to do, helps it link up with the disability communities to have a better understanding both about employment of disabled people, and also if the organization is a service organization or a policy organization or government, it needs to be able to be much more connected to the voices of disabled people to understand exactly what it is that we see as the barriers that we're facing, so we can be working collaboratively to remove these barriers.
Thank
I
you.
completely
Thank you,
agree with
Judy.
what you're saying.
Go ahead, Adriana.
Go on, Adriana.
And thank you. And what I'm gonna say goes in line with it, I think, and is also that we need to understand the barriers from different perspectives, because as I said, we're not only talking about people with disabilities as a general broad concept, but we're talking about disability interacting with other variables such as race, gender, socioeconomic levels. So we need to understand how these variables interact with disabilities and how it affects the needs people with disabilities need. Not the same to be a white woman with a disability than to be a rural woman or an indigenous woman here in Colombia with a disability, because the needs are going to be clearly different. The same applies to men. So it's something we also need to consider when talking about disability rights.
Good. Thank you, Adriana. Going a little bit back, Judy, I would like to ask you, what was, I mean, now that we're talking about the importance of taking all these aspects into account, could you tell us what was needed to make the ADA actually become law back in 1990?
So the Americans with Disabilities Act took many years to be able to develop, to have meetings with many groups, to be able to work very closely with lawmakers, and to be able to help bring together the disability community itself so that we could come together with agreement. Because if we didn't have the ability to work together, at least to some degree, the law would not have passed. There was really a need for unity. And there were many organizations that were involved with helping to advance the legislation. And one of them was a group called the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. A number of their staff, today I'm on their board, but a number of their staff were very involved in working with legislators and helping them understand the forms of discrimination that disabled people were experiencing. There was a lot of activity from groups like ADAPT, the National Center for Independent Living, the National Association of the Deaf, the National Federation of the Blind, many other groups that were invested in getting this legislation developed and passed. So it was a real grassroots movement, meaning disabled people from around the country were meeting with their federal elected representatives on the House and Senate side to allow people to understand the types of discrimination that people were experiencing, which was very important because the ADA is a national piece of legislation, and some members of the House and Senate needed to be convinced that there was discrimination and how it adversely affected people's lives and why there was a need for the ADA, which would have brought us up to the same level of protections that came about for the Civil Rights Act here in the US of 1964. So I think we were able to succeed in getting the ADA to become a reality because of so much work that was being done on so many levels. There was a man, unfortunately, who passed away. His name was Justin Dart, and he's called the father of the ADA. And Justin was originally from Texas. He had had polio, and he came to Washington. And he was highly respected, regarded. So that meant that he could play a role of mediator in many cases, but also he was one that people listened to. So when Justin would suggest that something happened, people would listen to him. But I think the most important aspect of this is that we had to come together as disabled people, regardless of the type of disability we had, and really work together to make sure the language for the law was going to be as beneficial as possible, and that we could come pretty much with one voice, speaking to our elected representatives about why they should support this legislation.
Great. Thank you for that, Judy. You mentioned something very important and you reinforced it again at the end, and is that sense of community and that work as a community. And with that in mind, I want to ask Adriana, in her opinion, and knowing the ADA and having been in the US as a student, for example, what would you say about the current situation of disability rights in Colombia? And what do you think persons with disabilities in Colombia could do to make sure the rights are met, or could do to raise more awareness, in key places, let's say in the government or in society, to make sure the rights are met?
I remember 10 years ago when I went on my Fulbright Scholarship, one of my biggest dreams was to create the Colombian with Disabilities Act. But at the end, didn't happen. But instead, 2 years later, they created this law in February 2013, actually. It was Law 1618, which is a very big law if you see it written, because it has things related to education, accessibility, employment, transportation, everything is there. So what the law requires is some decrees, and they already created them. So there's a decree for inclusive education, there's one for inclusive employment, there's another one for people with disabilities legal capacity. So I think in Colombia, we have a very robust legal framework. What we really need here is that everything that is nicely written be fulfilled in real life, because you see it there and it's perfect, but since there's now like a compulsory mechanism to for the entities and institutions to fulfill the law, it's not fulfilled. In many occasions, they just feel you're putting them like more work in the name of people with disabilities. And what institutions need to be aware of here in Colombia is that every change they do for people with disabilities is going to be beneficial for everyone. Thinking about accessibility, for instance, if you have a bathroom that is wide enough, you're not going to be benefiting only people who use wheelchairs, but you're also benefiting older adults, women with their babies. Everyone is going to be benefited. So that's what we need to understand. And also, as a disability community, we need to understand the laws very well. We need to make them fulfilled, but we need to make them fulfilled in a good way, because sometimes what happens here is that people, it's okay to fight for your rights, but you have to do it from the point of view of, teaching people on how to do it, because sometimes people in institutions do not even know how to work with people with disabilities. So we need to teach them. There's this kind of pedagogical work around it. It's not fighting, not just saying you have to do this for me because I have a disability and I have the right, because you're going to be hated. So that's not the proper way. And we also need to work together. It has to do with what Judith was saying a while ago. We need to work together. We need to pursue the same goal. Even talking about the same disability, that's very difficult sometimes to really be able to work together. To think that what is going to be beneficial for other people with different disabilities is going to be also beneficial for me. So we need to actually change that and leave egos and leave all bad stuff aside and start working together right now.
I think those are very important points. And let me also say that one thing that goes on in the United States is laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act enable people to file complaints and to go to court in some situations. But in addition to that, there is a fair amount of technical assistance. So, for example, at the Department of Justice, if you have a question, you can call a hotline. Somebody will answer that and answer your questions. They can give you information on how to file a complaint. They can give you information regarding if you want to go to mediation, where the two sides agree to sit down and try to negotiate what the resolution to the problem. There are other types of technical assistance, something called the Job Accommodations Network, which is a free online service, and also you can call them to get questions answered regarding employment. If you're a disabled person, if you're just someone interested in the subject matter, or if you work for a company. And then we have something called the Americans with Disabilities Act Regional Technical Assistance Centers, and they will work within the region providing people with information. Both the Jobs Accommodation Network and the 9 ADA Regional Technical Assistance Centers also can do trainings and be, very responsive. So I think TA, technical assistance, is really very important. It allows people to learn about the law, and many people here, the law is now more than 30 years old. There are many people that may know the term ADA or Americans with Disabilities Act, but they don't necessarily know the substance. And that's what some of these organizations are intended to do, is to help you get your questions answered, look at what direction you want to go. And also, the government agencies have responsibility for reviewing complaints that have been filed and making a determination as to whether or not the person filing as an aggrieved disabled person, in fact, was discriminated against. And then it will tell the perpetrator of the discrimination what their responsibility is to make corrections. So it's comprehensive. Definitely, things may not be happening quickly enough, but I think there is a reasonable amount built in so that you can get answers to questions and get guidance on how to move forward.
That's good to know. That's good to know, Judith. And I was just thinking that in the US, it's very, I think all universities have disability service, whether it's an office, whether it's a service, names change, but it's the same. Like you arrive as a person with a disability and you go there and you have access to all service they have for you, even if you're a student or a professor or you're the administrative level. So they have that at all universities. Of course, the level of fulfillment is different. There are universities that fulfill like the minimum requirements. Well, there are others that have like even their own software, their own disability related publications, stuff like that. But it's good to have that because you are sure they're going to be attending your needs when you get your admission. That what's happened to when I was applying for the scholarship, it was one of the first things I looked at. And here in Colombia, I have to say, well, we have improved. I mean, if we think of how things were like 10 or 20 years ago, undoubtedly we have improved a lot. But we're still missing some things because not all universities have, for instance, this disability service. They are more open today, but we still have to continue working for those universities that do not have the service. And also this network of employment you were mentioning is really good. And I am sure it's really helpful for people, because people with disabilities really need guidance on how to be prepared for a job. I mean, here in Colombia, we have entities working on that, but there's something missing. There's actually, there's missing a kind of connection sometimes to people and to people particular needs. I mean, it's good to think from the point of view of the employer, but also we need to think from the point of view of the potential employee. So things are changing. And also what I saw in the US was that in every forum for events, lectures, whatever, they always asked, do you have a disability? And I could check that option, and I could put which reasonable accommodations I needed and stuff like that. And it's kind of normal. Here is not normal. I mean, sometimes they do it, they are just learning. But the idea is to make it normal. We're just people with disabilities become a part of the landscape. That's the idea.
Yes. And I agree with you. It's really important that the provisions in the law are becoming more and more visible, so that, you know, when you go to an event, there is an expectation of what should be happening at the event regarding accessibility, for example. I think, you know, always needing to let people understand what the law is, because people become disabled every day and they didn't necessarily ever think about a law like the ADA or the equivalent in Colombia. So it's important for that. I you know, have had a number of jobs in the nonprofit world and in the government. And having jobs in both of those venues has been very important, because it's allowed me in the nonprofit world to really get a better understanding of the realities that disabled people are facing when things like going to school, trying to get a job, getting appropriate accommodations while on the job, voting rights and things of that nature. And being able to, we've seen more organizations being created here in the US, groups like the American Association of People with Disabilities, which is becoming a very powerful national voice. Groups like the National Council on Independent Living, which represent our Centers for Independent Living. But why these types of groups are so important, it is because they're a mechanism to be reaching disabled people around the country. So if there are potential threats to try to change the law, or, you know, there are good things or bad things going on, the networks can be utilized pretty quickly.
That's very good, Judy, and I thank you both for all the experiences and the comments you shared so far. And that sort of takes me to my next question. And since you actually mentioned it, Judy, you served as a special advisor for international disability rights at the State Department, and we're aware that there's been a huge progress, of course, in the US, as you just mentioned with this. But what have you seen as some of the barriers in the fight for disability rights, and what are you doing to address them? Because as we said before, it's like it doesn't end, right? It's not yet the fight.
I think we can say in Colombia, in the US, in many countries around the world, there are some changes that are happening. I think as disabled people and as family members and allies, we can see that the progress is not quick enough. And I think that's always something which is important, that we can celebrate what we have done, look at where we need to go and how to get there. So, our countries are different and similar at the same time. But here, one of the issues that we've been looking at now is around COVID, because many of the people who died from COVID were living in nursing homes and other restricted living environments. And we know that if people are living in their home and getting supports in their home, they are less likely to be exposed. And, if we see the numbers of people who died who were living in these congregate living programs, it was pretty significant. I was just on a call this morning with some people from Japan, and very interesting point that they made. They have a program there where some people are able to get personal assistance services to enable them to live in their homes, and in some cases to get out of these restricted living environments. And their data around the number of people with disabilities who died as a result of COVID, is going to be very interesting to analyze, because it looks very much like the people who are living in their own homes and getting supports fared better than people who are living in restricted living environments. Now, that's very important here because we're also trying to get the government, and this is not ADA, we're trying to get the government to pay for personal assistance, so that somebody like myself who needs help getting dressed and undressed, getting in and out of bed, doing many things that I can't do for myself, can get that service. Because right now, too many people who need this service are not getting it. And one of the reasons they're winding up in nursing homes is because they can't get services in their home. So I think what we see is the concerns that disabled people and allies have been raising for decades about the need for policies that will enable people not to go into institutions and to get out if they're there, and get appropriate services that they believe that they need in order to be more independent. So the future, I think, is expanding the disability rights movement, getting people who have disabilities to feel that it is their right to be able to speak up and out and not to feel ashamed, and that the society itself really needs to look at how it has been marginalizing disabled people, denying people jobs who are qualified for jobs, not interviewing people, which are violations. But, it's emotionally difficult for some people to file claims that they believe they've been discriminated against. That's one of the other reasons why I think it's so important for what Adriana has been discussing about her work, what I've been discussing, and what many of you listening to this program today are involved with also. Allowing disabled people to feel empowered to speak up, and that we want to be able to change the societies that we're living in, utilizing a number of different mechanisms.
Thank you, Judy, for that. I think you answered actually other of my questions here in one go, which is great. And I just want to go for a second before asking Adriana to add to this same question. Someone on Facebook tells us or asks better Judy specifically, could you share the ADA law, because he would like to read it and compare it with the law in Colombia. So if you could tell us and the audience where people can find it and read it for those interested.
You go to ada.gov, Americans with Disabilities Act.gov, GOV for government, ada.gov, and maybe the embassy can put it up.
Yeah, I'm asking my colleagues here in production, like behind the scenes, to share the link in the comments for anyone interested. Thank you, Judy.
Maybe
Adriana,
on the website also. Maybe on the website.
Okay. We also shared, by the way, at the beginning of the live session, the links to Judy's website, the link to Adriana's bio or profile in the Fulbright website as well. So anyone who wants to know more about, because we could spend hours here listening to these two great women and their life stories on disability rights. But unfortunately, we don't have the time for that, right? So for anyone who's interested in finding out more, we have those two links at the top of the comments of this session for you to visit and learn more about the work you have done, including the documentary that you already mentioned, Judy, Crim Camp, and that we also want people to watch because it's something very worth. I mean, if you really want to know the great story of this fight since Judy was very, very young, it is an absolutely recommendation and a must watch the documentary, if I may say. Now, moving forward, we're almost close to finishing. I wanted to ask Adriana. Well, Adriana, I want to ask if you want to add something to what Judy said about those barriers that you still find, for disability rights, and what are you doing to address them? And I think from your perspective, not only as the inclusion advisor for the Red Cross Committee here in Colombia, but as member of this network of women or blind women in Colombia, how do you see that situation?
Well, I totally agree with what Judith was saying in terms of COVID and the barriers it has generated. And here what has happened is that since there's this idea of blind people touching everything everywhere, which is not true. I mean, of course, I have to touch my cane, I have to touch the bills if I'm going to pay something. I have to take people's shoulders if someone's going to guide me at the street. But there's this idea that if you help a person with a person who is blind, you're gonna get the virus, which is not true. I mean, it's been really complicated for our autonomy or for getting help. Not in my case, but I know there are some friends of mine who have experienced issues in that sense, like even asking for directions. Sometimes is a problem because people don't even answer your questions. I mean, which is absolutely silly, you know. And I've also seen that many people with disabilities, unfortunately, have lost their jobs due to COVID and the negative changes it has generated in companies and businesses and stuff like that. So that's a big concern we have, because the idea is you now have to think not on creating more opportunities, but on how people can actually keep their job they're having. I mean, I'm so fortunate because I got my job and I kept my job despite the pandemic, and it even increased. But it's not the case for everyone. And sometimes, you know, women with disabilities, we need to think of women with disabilities who are in like vulnerable situations. And there are also women with disabilities who are also caregivers, which give them like an additional work. I mean, they have to do their job, but they have to also be caregivers, which generates a complicated situation. So we have to actually give them a voice and give a voice to women who live in their regions. As a network of women with visual impairment, we have this challenge of actually being able to arrive at every place in our country to actually get to really remote areas, so women can be empowered, because we think of women who live in cities, but what about rural women? What about indigenous women who are probably not visible? So we have still this challenge of making women visible, of making them aware of their rights and how to fight for them in a proper way, as I said before, and how to actually learn to work together. Because this is also a problem here in Colombia. Like many people with disabilities, they have the knowledge, they have the skills, they have the tools, but they only fight for their own interests. So it's something we need to change. And that's why we decided to work together as women, because unfortunately, the men voice are still predominant, but this is not the only voice. So we also have a voice as women with disabilities. We have different needs. So we need to continue speaking up and make our needs visible to the Colombian society.
And I'd like to say one other thing quickly, and that relates to when I was working at the State Department. So I was very proud because President Obama created a position called Special Advisor for International Disability Rights. And I served from 2010 to 2017. And one of the purposes of my job was with our team to help get knowledge about disability and issues around violations of human rights for disabled people, and for the State Department to have enough knowledge so that when working with governments and civil society, it can help advance rights of disabled people. Now, many people in universities are not learning about disability. They're not learning about human rights violations. So, you can graduate from a university in a field of development or human rights globally and really learn nothing at all about disability. So one of the reasons why I was happy about this happening today is because obviously the work that we started is still going on, and embassies like yours in Colombia is looking at the issue of the ADA to inform people. But that's one of the big jobs, and I'm sure this is true for Adriana in her job, that it's really helping mainly non-disabled people have a better understanding of who we are, what we're able to do, and how these organizations need to be addressing disability like they are gender and race and other areas.
That's very good. And I'm happy to say that there are some universities that are opening to what you just said. So they are creating courses. They have there's at the National University, for instance, they have this Masters on Inclusion and Disability. I think this is the name of that. And there are some other universities having courses. And even I myself worked as a university professor, as an online professor a couple of years ago, teaching undergrad students. So we're talking about very, very young people from, I don't know, probably 17 to 20 years old. So I taught this course on inclusion and disability. This is not the whole thing, but I think it's a great first step to start changing and to start implementing this in every university in Colombia so that they know about disability, they know about inclusion, they know about disability rights.
Thank you.
That's right. Just almost to finish, I've got a couple of questions more to ask. And since, as we mentioned at the beginning, Adriana got recognized this year with the Fulbright Excellence Award. And I would like to know if you think this award will impact your work as an advocate for disability rights in Colombia, because it got very promoted as well. I noticed you were on traditional media outlets, very important outlets in the country, reported about this award, Adriana, and I think that sort of raised your profile as an advocate as well for disability rights. So I was wondering if you think this recognition would have some impact on that.
Totally. It's going to have an impact, not only because it's a great honor, but rather because it's a great commitment for me to continue working for the inclusion of people with disabilities. And also because it shows that it's worthy to continue, it's worthy for Fulbright and for the Saldarriaga Concha Foundation to continue promoting the scholarship. because it shows that people with disabilities can actually leverage the opportunity to go to the United States, study their PhD, their master's, and then come here and make real changes. In my case, for instance, a few years ago, I also worked for the Ministry of Information and Communication Technologies, where I had the opportunity to lead a country project that allowed people who are blind or low vision to have free access to technology, to screen reading software and magnification software, so they could use computers. The project is still going, which is great. Now, well, I have the leading voice as the inclusion advisor of the ICRC, which is also very important, but rather than that, it gives me a commitment on thinking about more actions, more ways to promote inclusion, and more ways to promote inclusion of women with disabilities. So not only thinking about women who are blind or low vision, but also thinking about how to promote women with other disabilities as well. Yeah.
And blind and low vision people with other disabilities. I mean, they're blind and low vision people in wheelchairs who have intellectual disabilities, on and on. So I think one of the interesting aspects of disability is we cut across every aspect of life. That is right.
Yeah.
Yes. Judy, I wanted to go back to your book. You briefly mentioned it at the beginning. Well, you're the author of a long list of articles, publications, 2 books about disability rights. Your first book shares your story. However, in your most recent one, the one you mentioned, Rolling Warrior, which, by the way, one of our followers says, how come it was translated into Japanese before than Spanish?
Because the Japanese disability community worked with the publisher, and they translated the book.
Good.
And the publisher is looking for a company that will translate the book in Spanish, but I think it was the Japanese disability community that did it.
Okay, I think that's very important to tell.
I was going to say I can translate it.
That's great, Adriana. So Judy, you can keep in touch about that offline. But what I wanted to ask you about the book is, you did an amazing work targeting the youth. Could you tell us, how did you get to the idea of this book for boys and girls?
So the book, Being Human and Rolling Warrior, was done by me and a co-author. Her name is Kristen Joyner. And it was suggested that we take the book and adapt it for younger readers. And so the book itself is significantly the same, but with adaptations in the book, fewer pages, some modifications, and the title change and changes in chapter titles. We had a group of younger, like teenagers, who worked as an advisory committee for the book to make these transitions. And as I said, it was basically to take the book, Being Human, and be able to present it so that younger people would be interested in reading it. And I think we've touched on this a little bit, but one of the reasons why these books and other books written by disabled people are really important, and important that they be utilized in schools, is so that non-disabled children and adults can really get a better understanding of many of the issues that we've been discussing, including what we've had to do to fight when we're experiencing discrimination. Okay. And the advisory committee was mainly non-disabled young people. I'm sorry, mainly mainly disabled people.
Disabled people.
Yeah.
But
Correct.
the books need to be known because they seem to be restricted to the disability community. So it's like for the same people, the people that who already know about disability because they have a disability in themselves, or for their families, that they have to be like more openly known, so that the world can read them. Not only your book, Judith, but in general.
All the other books, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So for those who can read in English or Japanese, please check it out. It is a lovely, lovely book, Rolling Warrior. And just to wrap up our conversation, I want to ask one question to both of you, because I think it would be very interesting for our audience to know both your perspectives on this one. And it is, how do you think the US, since we are like on different places in terms of disability rights in the US and Colombia, how do you think the US experience could help guide other countries, and in this case specifically Colombia, in their journeys towards equality for persons with disabilities? So I think the experience of Adriana, having been a student in Florida, being a Colombian person living in Colombia, can give us a very specific perspective, and Judy as well, as a champion of this, can also give us, and having worked with other countries as well, can give us a very, very important view on this. So Adriana, would you want to go first?
Sure. Well, of course, Judy has more experience on this, but I just I went to the US for just a couple of years, which is not a whole life, of course. But it gave me time to know how this ADA is translated into real life, how it is really applied. So what we can learn is how entities and institutions actually apply the law in the US. Beginning with simple things, as what I said about the forums a while ago, including this disability-related question, thinking about reasonable accommodations. We
lost you,
We lost the audio. You can hear me, Judy?
I can.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll talk till Adriana comes back on. Yeah, I think what Adriana was talking about was, as a Fulbright fellow, she was at University in Florida. And some of the things that she was seeing, which I think are not currently happening in Colombia, she was saying are examples of things that should happen. And the item that she initially started discussing was, if there was a forum, people would be asked, are there accommodations that you might need? And that could help ensure that particular issues that a disabled person might need, like captioning, sign language interpreters, et cetera, would be provided. Now, let me also say that public events are supposed to be accessible. So it's a combination of letting people know what you might need that they may not have been thinking about. But if I could speak more broadly, I think, one of the values of Colombia and the United States working together is our ability to share information on the work that we're doing. You've been doing some very good work in Colombia. I know some people that have traveled from Colombia to the United States to study about our laws that have taken them back to Colombia. But likewise, I think Colombia is doing interesting work on its own. So I feel the embassy is a very important link, because it can help provide information to the Colombian community about work that is going on in the US. And there are limited opportunities after COVID where people can come to the US and people from the US can come down to Colombia to discuss some of these issues. So possibly being able to help people look at some of the websites like ada.gov ADA.gov does have material in Spanish. I do know that. And so that's something else also that the embassy might want to look at. And the ADA Regional Technical Assistance Centers do also have some of their materials in Spanish. So I think continuing to learn and develop closer relationships within the disability communities and within government, because there's a lot going on in US government in the area of inclusion of disability. I presume there's work going on in Colombia also, ways of looking at how to share that information, I think could be very important.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah, I think we lost Adriana, but thank you very much for complimenting what she was talking about. Let's hope she can connect again. But I think what you mentioned sort of expresses, the purpose of this very event that we're having today. We are very interested in trying to promote awareness of the ADA, of the importance of disability rights, of the importance of rights of people with disabilities as any other human rights, right? And it's something that it has to be, at the top, of course, of all our work. I'm glad to see some of the comments that my colleagues have shared throughout the program in the stream of people thanking not just us for doing this program, but the US for having passed a law like the ADA 31 years ago, because that's for sure kind of an example, and a starting point for some other countries where there is not that much work on the topic. So it's very, very, very important. And we're very glad to be able to share this information with people, create awareness among our audience about this. You've shared very, very good links, information that we hope those interested in our audience can, go there and check out. And it's like you said, it's something that we have to work all together, as many other issues in life. And it's not just a matter of people with disabilities getting together. It's a matter of all society getting together and working for the rights of others, because we all have to be part of it. So we're very glad to have the audience that we had today commenting and thanking you and Adriana for sharing your experiences. We hope we have the opportunity to keep talking about this and having these kind of events. I think although the pandemic doesn't seem to be a good thing for sure, this is, I think, a very positive one. And it's that thanks to that, we were able to have these kind of events with people that it would be very, very difficult, to have you here in Colombia, before pandemic times. It was more difficult. It required more, to have like guest speakers physically here in Colombia. That's of course part of our job, but all this virtual world has made possible to have these amazing opportunities of having great speakers like you on our platforms for our audience. I don't think Adriana managed it again, and I'm really sorry for that. Our time is up, unfortunately. I want to thank you very much for joining us today, for sharing your experiences. It's really, really inspirational. You and Adriana have done amazing work working, on advocating for the rights of the persons with disabilities, for sure. And it is very, very clear that the fight is not over. So we hope that everyone who joined us today found this conversation as inspirational as I found it myself. And also they sort of, it helps to reflect on the very important achievements so far, but also on the importance of continuing working on equality for all.
And I hope the outcome of this is that, I just want to say that I hope our discussion today inspires you all to go out and fight stronger. So thank you very much, Liliana and Diana, for inviting me. And tell the ambassador I said hello.
Will do. Thank you very much, Judy. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to all our followers and audience today in all our channels. And remember to follow us on our social media channels so we can see you soon again with another activity. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.